The mid-2000s were a transitional time for gaming. Games had just emerged from its ugly duckling phase of 3D as technology started to improve, and the advent of high-capacity storage allowed developers with enough room to follow their ambitions, but it wasn't quite there to allow them to achieve them, forcing creative and innovative designs to overcome these limitations. Game design had shifted from its founders' era, where good game practices were still being discovered and moving past its arcade roots, but we weren't quite into the modern era where designs had become homogenized and iterative. Development costs were rising. Gone were the days where 2 or 3 developers could produce a full game, but development was still cheap enough and an audience receptive enough that you can make a particularly niche or experimental title and still find success. It was an era that gave us games like Silent Hill 2 and Metal Gear Solid 3, while games like Katamari Damacy were rolling around the corner. The same person who brought you Resident Evil 4 would turn around and go make God Hand, a game that its DNA defined the spectacle fighter, then 20 years later would be the executive producer for Hi-Fi Rush, a game that not only pays homage to the style and aesthetics of that era, but the very essence of a niche experimental budget title that found success. We've seen the return of fixed camera survival horror games, a genre that has been mostly dormant since the PS2 era, and not just from indie games either, but getting the backing of big publishers. In fact, we've seen publishers take notice of this trend, and we've seen remakes of games like Crisis Core, Resident Evil 4, and Metroid Prime. With inflated development budgets and inflated everything else, everyone is looking to save on cost, and we might be on our way to a renaissance of innovative budget titles. But there is one trend in particular I want to talk about, one that is rarely discussed in the retrospectives of this era, and the many games that came from it are often overlooked. It was an unusual cultural zeitgeist that had this intense, inescapable presence, with nearly every developer caught in its web, collectively billions being funneled into this trend, but as quickly as it came, it faded into obscurity, never to return with the same fervor. It was an era so surreal that those who lived it dismiss it merely as a collective fever dream. Yo, remember when everyone was just making card games? Yeah, that was the thing that happened. Yes, I know, card games had existed well before the 2000s, and many games use card-based mechanics even now. But I'm not talking about games like Baten Kaitos, which were intentionally designed to be a card-based game, though speaking of, it's weird that that game is coming back too. And no, I'm not talking about the bonus mini-games that you'd find in high-budget RPGs. Though, speaking of that, Squaresoft did release Tetramaster as a standalone online game. It costs like $2 a month to subscribe to it, I think. No, I mean that there was a period where developers said with their whole chest, hey, you remember our critically acclaimed stealth action game known for its heavy cinematic and highly political story with deep narrative themes? Well, I got an idea to turn that into a card game. Let's release it on the PlayStation Portable with 3D goggles. I mean, some of these made sense. Kingdom Hearts Chain of Memories, for example, you really couldn't have the same depth of combat you would find on the PS2 on the Game Boy Advance. Giving it card-based gameplay creates a unique experience while hiding the limitations of the hardware. That's really smart game design, and it shows just how creative developers can be when there's restrictions on them. But there was also a lot of, hey, what if we took Mega Man Battle Network and just, I don't know, attached a card game to it? Oh, and we could sell 3 different versions with minimal changes, Pokemon style. Capcom, SNK, Square Enix, From Software, Sony, Nintendo, Sega, all of them were trying their hand at being the next Magic the Gathering. While of course I could make a huge video talking about all of them, I want to focus on one in particular. Mainly because it epitomizes this strange, surreal shift into card-based games the most. And whereas Kingdom Hearts made sense because it was a spin-off on portable consoles that for the most part enjoyed a potential leeway of being considered a side adventure, this game was a home console release to one of the biggest games of the early 2000s. It was one of the very few games that took advantage of the GameCube's limited online capabilities. Also, I was kind of working on a video already about PSO, and this took like a huge chunk of it. Like, I really couldn't take it out because it's literally part of the series, but it was so big that it would have been like half the video, so... This is Design Documentaries, your in-depth look at a game's history, design, and legacy. And today we're taking a look at Phantasy Star Online, Episode 3, C.A.R.D. Revolution. So for those of you who are not familiar with Phantasy Star Online, or Phantasy Star in general, well, it's weird that you decided to start your introduction to the series with this video of all ones, but I admire your curiosity, so here's a brief overview. In the late 80s, Japanese role-playing games were huge, well, in Japan anyway. However, due to Nintendo's illegal monopolistic practices requiring every developer to sign an exclusivity agreement, Sega had lacked developers for the popular genre, so they decided to have a go at it themselves. Rather than fall on old fantasy tropes like knights and dragons, they instead opted to make a futuristic setting with lasers, spaceships, and aliens. Being one of the few JRPGs available for the console, it was a moderate success and gained a bit of a cult following, though being a distant third behind Dragon Warrior and Final Fantasy. After 4 games and 2 spin-offs, the series fell dormant for several years. However, needing a killer app for its new console, the Dreamcast, Sega revived the series in Phantasy Star Online, shifting the gameplay of the series to a Diablo clone. It was both a technical marvel and a great experience, which ultimately led it to winning Game of the Year. Sadly, PSO's success wasn't able to pull the Dreamcast out of its own death spiral. When Sega had went multi-platform, it ported the series to both the Xbox and the GameCube, featuring a completely new expansion, or episode if you will, and being one of the very few online-capable GameCube games. In fact, in America, it was the only online-capable GameCube game. At the time, it was difficult to say how much demand there actually was for a sequel though. PSO was popular, don't get me wrong, and I'm sure fans of the series would have loved more content. But the online play was limited, and the game started aging very quickly with the release of other Diablo clones. Forums were rife with discussions that they wanted to see Phantasy Star become a true MMO, very much like how Warcraft and Final Fantasy were doing the same. But let's be real here, there was no way that was going to happen. Sega had just quit console development and their consumer products division, i.e. games, was losing money each year. Sega could not afford to shift the series into an MMORPG, but there was still demand for more PSOs, so they gave them the next best thing, a card game. Okay, so why a card game of all things? Well, according to Sega producer Yuji Naka, well, going from the Dreamcast version on the version 2 to the GameCube version, we came to feel like the fan base wanted a new experience. So in order for new users to enjoy PSO, we thought we should develop a game that would return to the traditional turn-based style rather than action. This opinion has been going around for a while. This was further established by Yojiro Ogawa, the game's director. We believed it would be hard for users to get into an Episode 3, except for those who enjoyed Episode 1 and 2, if we merely offered more of the same. I like new users to be introduced to the PSO world with this new genre. Okay, fair enough, and listen, I'm not here to accuse admitted inside trader Yuji Naka of lying, but I feel like there might have been just a itty bitty tiny teeny little context left out of this. So here's a bit of conjecture on my part. As I mentioned in the intro, card games were becoming extremely popular. Magic the Gathering was poised for its 10th anniversary, Yu-Gi-Oh! Was starting to take off as both an anime and a card game in 2002, and the technology was finally there to allow for bigger digital-based card games including Lords of Vermilion, and later Sony's camera-based Eye of Judgment. And Sega was already intimately familiar with developing card games, having developed the Japanese exclusive Magic the Gathering on the Dreamcast,
Mountain Goat,
and their World Cup Championship Football being the very first arcade-based trading card game. Simply put, card games were big, and Sega was already pulling in a decent chunk of change from the genre. More cynically, turning PSO into a card game meant that Sega didn't actually have to do all that much work. They didn't have to make a whole new chapter for PSO, they didn't have to make new areas, they didn't have to add new levels, spells, or progressions, they didn't have to model new items or monsters. They didn't even have to change the lobby or buy new servers. Just take PSO 1 and 2 assets, throw it into a card game, and there you go. And genuinely, I don't blame them. Making a completely new type of game out of old assets doesn't mean the game is going to be bad. And I respect that ingenuity. But, come on. Yuji. I don't think we want a card-based RPG based on our highly successful Game of the Year Diablo clone is something that fans have been saying for a while. In fact, the initial reception to PSO E3 C.A.R.D was not very favorable. When E3 revealed at E3, supposedly the fan reaction was, "What the hell? Alright, joke's over. Show me the real game." Most of the news that we got about it was that it was so different from PSO. That and the fact that the 5 prototype PSO minifigs were stolen from their E3 booth and never found or returned. And hey, those were expensive. You had to buy molds to make those things. 3D printing wasn't a thing back then. However, fans also weren't up in arms about it and screaming betrayal in crowded conventions. Remember, again, everyone was making their own card game at this time, so the complaint seemed to be more that Sega was just kind of doing what everyone else was doing. There was some initial disappointment, but it was still a new Phantasy Star game. It was an online card game which at that point didn't exist on home consoles, and people who bought the GameCube broadband adapter could finally play more than just one game. A lot of the initial doubt regarding the change ultimately gave way to hype, or at the very least, curiosity. By the time the game released in Japan in November of 2003, the news broke out that Sega's foray into cards was actually pretty good. Americans would have to wait until March of 2004 to try it out for themselves, and then PAL regions would have to wait another 4 months, but eventually the gaming world was once again connected, this time by digital cardboard. So the question remains, was it any good? Does it still hold up? Well, the only way to figure that out is to try it for ourselves. So grab your deck and start shuffling, because I'm about to give you the deal of Phantasy Star Online Episode 3 C.A.R.D. Revolution. Not surprising anyone at this point, Card Revolution is in fact a card game. Specifically, it's a dueling-based collectible card game, similar to games like Magic the Gathering, Legend of the Five Rings, and Yu-Gi-Oh! You duel people with decks you make from cards you collected, earning more cards to increase your options. In the Phantasy Star universe, no, not that one, get that one out of here. The conceit is that a special discovery with Photon now allows hunters to store items in a card form as opposed to head-sized boxes, which for some reason still limits you to carrying 30 items at once, except now you can only access 6 at a given time. They are drawn randomly and now easily break. You know, sometimes creating new technology requires you to take several steps back. You gotta give Sega at least a C for trying to make it make sense in context, but what it comes down to is you build a deck using familiar items, monsters, spells from the original PSO, ultimately beating your opponent and their deck. Episode 3 has effectively 3 modes of play. A free play mode where you can go against the computer, or a local friend with decks you built from cards you unlocked with friends able to bring their characters and decks over from their game. An online mode where you can do the same with players all around the world, compete in tournaments, and do online specific missions, assuming you had a broadband adapter and were willing to pay the $8.99 a month subscription fee, of course. For those that didn't, the main attraction was likely the game's story mode. Speaking of the story, being that this game is called Episode 3, you're likely also not surprised by the fact that this is a sequel to Episode 1 and 2. Really, the title just kind of spells it out, and I kind of mean that literally too. The story takes place 21 years after the events that set off the original PSO. Pioneer 2 still hasn't colonized Dragol yet, and citizen trust in the government is at an all-time low, brewing on the brink of a silent civil war. Which I tell you, oof, that hits a lot different today compared to 20 years ago. Sega was still very much into the whole play as both the heroes and the villains like they did in Sonic Adventure 2, So here you can also play as both factions. You have the hero side, hunters turned mercenaries, and the dark side, a rebel group known as ARCs. No, I'm sorry, that's with a Z, ARGs. Upon starting story mode, you create your character like the original PSO, and then select the side you're wanting to join, though this isn't really a dedicated choice because you can switch anytime you start story mode. The story is mission-based. You're given a task either directly related to the plot at hand, or some side quest that gives more details about the characters, but you typically go to a place, face against an opponent, be rewarded with a story beat, and then move on to the next mission. It's fairly short, straightforward, and there's not many twists, and I feel like this has to do with Sonic Team being under a tight deadline and budget. You're also not very involved with the story yourself, but more as an observer. The character you spend about 20 minutes making, yeah, that doesn't really ever come into play. You use it to move around in the game's offline and online lobbies, but you don't even play your character. Instead, it's these 24 characters that end up being front and center. They are mostly the ones that discover the story on your behalf. Your role is really more of a commander observing the battlefield and giving orders in battle, but you don't have any agency within the game's story other than choosing what characters to bring on what mission. There is a mechanical reason for this, but it is a bit deflating compared to the original. Speaking of deflating, Alright, so I'm going to go on a little bit of a tangent here, but this isn't going to make any sense unless you have context for the original PSO. Partly because this was a video that eventually was part of another video, but man, its own. Anyway, the original PSO storyline wasn't groundbreaking by any means, but it wasn't nothing. The colonization plot and the destruction of Pioneer 1 quickly gives way to the principal's concern for his missing daughter, Red Ring Rico. As you explore Ragol, you find logs that Rico had left behind that ultimately leads you to the doomed fate of Ragol and its inhabitants. It's certainly no Diablo 2, but for the Dreamcast, it was a somewhat compelling reason to check out these little glowing pillars. And it did all this without interrupting the gameplay too much. That and the short narratives and returning characters found in Quest, as well as a few callbacks to the original Phantasy Stars, made the story overall fairly charming. Episode 2 followed the same formula, except this time following a hunter named Floen who was slowly being corrupted by a parasite, allowing you to discover the dark secrets of Pioneer 1. For all that it's worth, PSO did an excellent job even if its approach was minimalist. Episode 3, not so much. As mentioned, the plot focuses on two perspectives, the hero side and the dark side. As you can probably guess from Sega's last attempt at this kind of storytelling, the hero side isn't particularly good. It's a bunch of well-meaning but seemingly uncritical mercenaries who are getting led by an inept principal who is just as likely to give you top-secret missions as much as he is giving you his child's homework. Meanwhile, the dark side isn't particularly dark. It's more of an anti-government force using questionable methods because government bad. That's not to say there isn't a story here. If you really get into it, the focus seems to be on the other characters as they all seemingly have connections with one another. There's a lot of deep subtext in the narrative, allowing you to theorize on a character's backstory and motivation, and it's sometimes told through these well-drawn comic book style cutscenes, when it's not just simply idle models with comic bubbles over their head, but hey, it's PSO. And it does offer some closure to the other two episodes of PSO. There is genuinely stuff to like here. It's just a shame that you can completely miss it. And no, that's not me being hyperbolic. I mean that you can, quite literally, miss most of the plot elements entirely. To see these cutscenes, you need to be the right character on the right mission and do the missions in the right order. And the game makes no mention of what character to pick or which order to play them in. You might have an upwards of a 1 in 12 chance of picking the right character for the mission. If you didn't, congratulations, you just missed part of the story. Did you pick the wrong mission? Well, guess what? Now you just missed out on 2 other missions and the story and rewards that came with them. This is the only game I know where the strategy guide was a requirement for the story. It's such a frustrating design choice, and I'm not really sure why they designed it like that. I'm guessing to extend the replay value, vary which characters you might use, or maybe to get you to care more about the relationship between characters, but it just does not work here. But I highly doubt too many people were playing a card game for the lore. I mean, I did. I played the crap out of Legend of the Five Rings, and that game had an amazing amount of lore, but I digress. What about the gameplay? The two different perspectives provide more than just a story difference, but each side also plays differently, giving an asymmetrical gameplay element to it. The hero side depends on their gear to survive, equipping various weapons, armor, and items from the original PSO. They can equip everything from the Amada Saber to the god-tier Sumakiri J sword. Arcs instead summon monsters from Rigol to do their bidding. Everything from the humble Rag Rappy, to the blue Owl Rappy, to the stronger L Rappy, to the holiday-themed Rappies, to the deadly Dell Rappy. Attacking hunters in a deadly swarm of a peep crossbred with a penguin. And I guess you can really summon all the other monsters if you want to. They're all there, I guess. But the goal for each side is the same. Get the opponent's hit points down to 0. Each creature or item has its own strengths, cost, damage, range, and hit points. And yes, the items have hit points now. Hunters equip their items and also use them as shields against attacks. They can become powerful one-Newman armies, but they have the disadvantage of being the only target on the battlefield, which can often leave them surrounded and having to fight through waves of enemies to get to their opponent. Arcs instead depend on their creatures to protect them, being vulnerable if singled out, but their threats are spread out. Therefore, the hero side have to play a game of threat assessment. They need a combination of powerful attacks against single opponents and area of effect attacks against swarms. Instead, focus on enemy placement and maneuvering, needing to overwhelm their enemies with decisive strikes, and constantly applying pressure so the hunter can't be too well equipped. Both sides have access to action cards, which contain special attacks and defensive cards, allowing both sides to cast spells, throw a powerful sucker punch, or defend against or dodge attacks. There is also assist cards which affect all players and either add a buff, debuff, or change the rules of the game. Nearly every card also has a special ability, and these are quite varied. Some might do more damage to certain enemy types or item types, others might freeze an enemy on a hit, others might take any damage from weak or even overly strong attacks. And not just that, but the character you play as can also change your strategy as well. Each character has a different base attack power, technique power, movement range, hit points, and abilities. Some might lower the cost of techniques, for example. Rufina increases the power of attack action cards. Orland increases his attack power depending on how many swords are on the battlefield. All android characters are immune to status effects but can't cast techniques. In a very similar way to Magic's Commander-style format or L5R Strongholds, the best strategy is often building to your character's strengths and weaknesses, but with over 450 cards in the pool, there's a lot of different strategies you can pursue. All things considered, Card Revolution does a lot of things very well. It does help that every card, even weaker ones, still tend to have a use. For both the Hunters and the Arcs.
What about now? It's time to rock with the biggity buck bumble. What about now? It's time to rock with the biggity buck bumble.
You can only have an amount of creatures or items that total up to 8 cost on the board at once. So if you equip an item with 6 cost, that means you can only have another item with 2 or less. While more powerful cards are, well, more powerful, having less total items on you mean you have less to attack with, meaning you would be doing less damage overall and might have less to defend with. This makes smaller cost cards like the basic Saber or Booma still valuable to keep around even after you unlock better cards. However, how you play these cards becomes a problem. See, in most games you need a certain resource to play certain cards. In Magic the Gathering, it's mana from the lands you tap, which you can only add 1 mana each turn. And cards might require a different kind of mana. In Legend of the Five Rings, it's fate that you can spend or save each turn. This isn't just resource management, it's about pacing. You don't really want players to play their strongest cards from the start, but rather you want them to have to build towards it. It gives the chance for weaker cards to shine because they might be important for the early and mid-game strategies.
Mountain Goat.
Each player then plays progressively stronger and stronger cards, which is in turn a form of escalation. Because a player might be behind or even facing possible defeat, but if they could just hold out till they can pull that one card that trusts the heart of the cards and flip it and play it, it might change the tide of battle. It creates a stakes as the power level of these cards rise, making misplays that much more costly. Ultimately, this leads to a climax, with cards and conditions that can break any stalemate. Something where the victory feels like it's won by skill to get it on the board, but not so dominating that the losing player isn't willing to shuffle their deck or whip out a new one just to play again. In episode 3, your resource is a 6-sided die. Yep, an entirely random roll determines how much you can play per turn, meaning that you can roll a 2 and your opponent rolls a 6, and your opponent can play 3 times as much as you can. It is entirely possible to get multiple rounds of bad luck in a row and not be able to do much other than your basic attack, while your enemy loads up on the best equipment and beats you down with powerful attacks. Or you might be left without points to defend yourself against a sucker punch despite you playing basically perfectly otherwise. Granted, you might get lucky and your opponent gets bad rolls, but that doesn't really feel like a satisfying way to win either. No story was told, your skill wasn't on show, you just got lucky. This design choice does make lower cost cards more valuable, but that also in turn devalues the excitement of even unlocking a fancy new card because it's entirely dependent on your luck if you draw it, and if you draw it, when you'll be able to play it, since even if you have a roll to spin it on, there's a good chance you won't even have the available slots to play it until your opponent breaks some of your gear. And by then, who knows if you have the roll for it. Now, there is a progression system. Anytime you destroy an item or a creature, you gain some experience, and after you gain 10 experience, you level up, which in game turns translates to a static +1 bonus onto your rolls, which gives more consistency. Honestly, this is pretty cool. It keeps with the theme of the original PSO, it was an RPG after all, but it also incentivizes the use of quality cards instead of spamming a bunch of cheap ones. But this doesn't alleviate the randomness too much, and you level too slowly for it to be much use. Basically, what I'm saying is if you're gaining experience, you've already built the character. There are ways to alleviate the dice rolls, such as using SS cards that give all dice a bonus, including to your opponent, or building around strategies that allow you to gain more experience or drain your opponent's experience, or making randomness a negligible factor. In the game's free play mode, you can actually change the game's rule set to reduce the randomness. In the game's first few missions of story mode, they actually have this randomness reduced, and then they just change it in favor of more randomness later for some reason. But this is a positive thing because nearly every aspect of the game's core rules can be altered for a better experience, and it's used to great effect to make a variety of different missions in the game's story mode. What cannot be so easily remedied is the game's AI. Now, listen, making realistic AI for a card game is deceptively difficult. This isn't just giving an enemy a few moves to cycle through in an RPG. You have thousands, if not millions, of permutations of potential cards that can be in the hand at any given time. And that's not really including trying to make general deck strategies. And when you're having to account for other randomness, yeah, I think overall Sonic Team did a pretty decent job. When it comes to single battles, at least. The game features team battles where it seemingly should be where the game is at its most fun. Phantasy Star Online was at its heart a co-op game, and there's a lot of cards built around this 4-player mode. But when your AI partner decides to run in and get himself killed, losing you the match and forcing you to the main screen and leaving a permanent loss in your record, intensely frustrating. This is really what made me start to question if the battles I was winning were me genuinely having a good deck strategy or them just not playing the right cards at and giving me the win. And speaking of earning, that's another one of the game's issues. There are hundreds of cards to unlock in the game, and you can have a total of 3 of each per deck, but for each match you can unlock anywhere from 5 to 11 cards depending on your rating at the end, which is based on how well you do. The pack you choose seems to have favor what kind of cards you're going to get of items, monsters, etc., but there doesn't seem to be any rarity scaling per pack. Doing better doesn't give you access to rarer or more complex cards, and you aren't guaranteed to get a rare card, or you could get lucky and get all rare cards. However, before you start unlocking particularly good cards, you need to level up your card level. You can earn up to 10 to 25 per match, and gaining 100 points earns you a card level, and it goes up to 999. and your offline and online are kept separate. This game is very grind heavy, and you could be playing through months before you get a chance to fully unlock everything. But that last part was likely intentional. This wasn't a game meant to be played for a few dozen hours on a weekend home from school. It was meant to be something that you played for hundreds of hours and potentially years. It had an offline mode, but this was called Phantasy Star Online. It was designed around online play. The ability to play with other players, trade cards, participate in tournaments, all of which were method to unlock cards. Being a card game and not having the option to introduce cards every few months, or really at all, really the only option you had was making it more difficult to get the cards you wanted. So you would be more inclined to play and trade with other players and participate in tournaments to get rare cards. Really, the story mode was likely an afterthought. It was much more likely that online play was what this game was designed around. I say likely because I personally never got to experience the online portion. It was 2003, I was 14, I didn't exactly have access to my parents' credit card yet, and from everything I read on forums, it seems like after the first year or so, the online community was thriving. I imagine a lot of the flaws of the game were alleviated by playing with other players. You have to remember that online gaming wasn't as ubiquitous as it is nowadays, and playing online was still a novelty for console gamers. We were willing to put up with a lot of rough design choices just simply for how cool it was to play with other players at any given time. However, as you can probably hazard to guess, PSO Episode 3 Card Revolution wasn't exactly a revolution. Not for gaming as a whole, not for card games, not for Sega, not even PSO itself. Critics liked it, giving it mid to high marks across the board, though fully admitting the game's myriad of problems. It's very difficult to tell what kind of sales that Sega expected or how many units were sold, but it likely wasn't very much. Google's Bard AI had mentioned that it sold over 1.2 million units across the world. However, Google's Bard also said the game didn't have an online multiplayer, so take that for what you will. That number is likely very inaccurate because that means Card Revolution would have sold as well as the Resident Evil remake. Likely the real number was a fraction of that, and even then, the broadband adapter's limited availability meant that it didn't really see many people online. It would be debatable to call this game a cult classic or an underrated gem. It's even difficult to say if this would have been considered a niche, bold experiment because, again, everyone was doing card games around this time. Episode 3, while unique for its theme and concept, being one of the very progenitors of online card games, didn't necessarily shape what the future of those games would be. If not for it being Phantasy Star, it's difficult to even say if I would be talking about it otherwise. Sega themselves didn't really seem to be too fond of the game either. You could definitely make the argument with how they treated the original Phantasy Star Online was less than ideal, but they really dealt Card Revolution a bad hand. It's very obvious that Sega had no plans for Card Revolution outside of its release. Shortly after Card Revolution, Sega had developed and released Blue Burst in 2005, which featured a whole new episode, Episode 4. But this is a bit of a misnomer because the gameplay returned to the action RPG Diablo clone, and its story is set back in the Episode 1 and 2 timeline. But they don't mention, foreshadow, or even reference the events of Episode 3. There is an early screen of a PC build where it was called PSO Card Battle, but it's hard to say if they even had a port in mind, and no port ever came to the PC or Xbox. Episode 3 would be rather unceremoniously taken offline at the same time as the GameCube servers for PSO 1 and 2 in 2007. And that was effectively the end of Episode 3. But that's not to say Card Revolution should be forgotten. While it might not be some incredible game lost to time, and it might not even mean much to the series as a whole, what Episode 3 is almost the perfect encapsulation of the culture of gaming in the mid-2000s. It's a game that's representative of the era, when companies were still willing to create new ideas and concepts while navigating the increasing cost of development. When companies that struggled were still willing to make games that they wanted to exist, even if they didn't need to exist. An era of design where mechanics and common practices weren't so defined, and that every game, even those in the same genre, were willing to push the boundaries to see what they could accomplish, even if those experiments ended with less than stellar results. And most importantly, it was a time when players were receptive to it. Really, this could be considered the greatest success of Episode 3. Even with the initial hesitation of the change of gameplay, player reception was overall fairly positive, and Episode 3 had won fans over. It wasn't an amazing game, but it was an interesting one. It's also an experience that you can't really get anywhere else, even 20 years later. There aren't many card games that capture the essence of the game that inspired them. Explore stories with asymmetrical narrative design and unique characters, with the two different story arcs. Story arcs. Completely customizable rule sets, and an online mode that allow you to play with other players all around the world without many language barriers. Maybe there was some truth to what insider trader Yuji Naka had said. Fans wanted a change. Maybe not a permanent one, but an enjoyable diversion. Which is why the fan community has been keeping Phantasy Star Online alive. Episode 3 has been given similar love to the other episodes in the series, being kept alive through private servers and discords. There are even those who have modded the game to bring back cards cut from the original release. Who knows, maybe sometime in the future we'll see a game that drew heavy inspiration from Episode 3. Or maybe with the return of this era game design, we'll also see a return of the weird card game spin-offs. Well, okay, not likely, but a dwarf can dream. Because even if they did, these games are an experience of a time and culture that really can't be replicated today, but they can still be experienced through these time capsules of their designs, and it's still worth giving them their due. After all, gaining experience builds character.